Now, the early AR-15s that Colt built, and this is one of them, have the green color stock, and I believe these were the ones that were sent to Vietnam in the 61 time frame for the first initial tests. And that takes us back to sort of the resurrection of the AR-15. I suppose if the Vietnam War hadn't come along or hadn't grown hotter with U.S. participation ultimately, and certainly U.S. support of the Vietnamese, we wouldn't have seen much of the AR-15 in the long run. And this brings us back to that matter of timing. What do you recall of ARPA's having sent those, Advanced Research Project Agency, having sent those first sample guns to Vietnam?
What do I recall of that event? Well, it was rather a hush-hush thing. I mean, they were trying to keep it under cover, and we really didn't get much feedback on what was happening with those weapons once they were delivered over there. We had an idea where they were going and what they were going to do, but I really wasn't involved in that part of that program at all when they actually went over there. I saw a couple of the field test reports, and that was about it on the weapon.
What was the long-term effect of that study? Studies?
Yeah, I think the long-term effect was really quite obvious. It was the beginning of a movement that actually started got things underway to start the adoption of the weapon. ARPA at the time, of course, it still is a part of the Defense Department, and there were quite a few people in the Defense Department under McNamara who brought in this so-called whiz kid bunch from universities and whatever to help out in their operation analysis and so forth. And they were really not sold on going back to a large caliber weapon like the M16, and I think a lot of them are just waiting or looking for an opportunity to see something else tried, and this was the first time that this opportunity came along, and they were more or less the instigators of this field trials, as they called it, or whatever, operational trials in Vietnam. When that happened, that started a whole movement of the effectiveness of a large caliber weapon versus the small.
Okay. They need for you to stop moving the magazine. It's picking in your Morse coding into the. Well, we got a break here. With the ARPA enthusiasm for the AR-15, the Defense Department, in effect, becomes now your advocate for the small caliber weapons as opposed to the Continental Army Command under General Wyman. What was the reaction of the ordnance people? Did they still ignore the AR-15?
I think that you say they ignored it. They acknowledged what was happening, but they were awfully busy trying to produce the M14 and get it, all the quantity out that they could. And they really weren't too involved in any way because it had never been officially adopted by the Army. If it had been, of course, they would really get involved with it. But until that time, they were pretty much hands off. There's much they could do. Actually, the results of the first trials over there with the AR-15 in Vietnam was pretty spectacular, because what happened was, and as we knew, I'd been over there before, years before, that the Asiatic people, being small stature and everything, loved the small gun. They could handle it, they could fire it. We were giving them 30 caliber weapons like M1s and so forth to try to fight with, and they were just too large for them. And I know that you want to go digress a little bit in history. When Bob and MacDonald and I went over to demonstrate these weapons in Southeast Asia this was before the Vietnam War really got going, years before, we took along AR-10s and AR-15s. And the reason was these 15s were kind of left over from the Army's test program and pretty much given up on. And the AR-10 was actually what Colt was going to build. Colt was going to build an AR-10, and they were picking up the license that the Dutch had. And the Fairchild became unhappy with the Dutch license arrangement, and they decided to give it to Colt. Well, as soon as we made our tour over there and had both weapons, and I started demonstrating them, became obvious in the first demonstration. They didn't want anything to do with a lightweight 30 caliber weapon, but they all just loved the small caliber one. So MacDonald, after a couple of demonstrations, and he was Colt's agent for that part of the world, said, hold everything. He sent a cable back, quite a lengthy cable, and said, stop any idea of producing the 30 caliber. He says, the only thing I want for my part of the world, and I think this is the most viable location right now, is the small caliber weapon. So Colt, on the basis of that cable, stopped everything and started going the other way. Well, when we got back into the test later on, the DARPA test, or ARPA at the time, it was very apparent that this thing made a big hit because it was light and it was handy, and it also had the stopping power capabilities that no one realized, and became a very hot issue over there. And so with this information, these people in the Defense Department who were more or less not enthused about the M14 seized upon this and started running some comparative trials of their own and making studies on effectiveness. And they came up with a paper that pretty well shot down the M14 rifle. So with that information and that pressure from inside of McNamara's own group, he stopped the production of the M14 rifle. And timing being everything, the Vietnam War started cranking up more and more. The advisors became more and more and started participating in these operations rather than being advisors. And incidentally, what was happening over there, the few AR-15s that were over there, the advisors started taking them away from the troops, and they were picking up the weapons and using them themselves and told the troops to go find something else. So it was a pretty good endorsement. So after McNamara actually then stopped the production of the M14, that left the United States in kind of a peculiar situation. They had really no production military weapon at the time, and they were getting involved in a shooting war. And then Colt, in the meantime, had tooled up on these AR-15s and were producing them in larger and larger amounts. So here Colt was the only manufacturer, or only facility, manufacturing a military weapon with a shooting war starting up.
So in 1964, if I remember right, the Army and Air Force ordered what was supposed to be a one-time buy of M16s, just over 85,000 for the Army and about 19,000 for the Air Force. Mm-hmm. And nearly all of those guns wound up in the Vietnam theater.
Yeah, that was a one-time buy, and it was by orders directly from McNamara. And needless to say, the Army didn't like very well being ordered by some civilian on something that they had always had control of, and that was the picking and ordering of their own rifles. And they didn't like that very well, and they wanted everybody to know they were unhappy. Colt seized on the idea and thought that they would make a deal with the Army and license them, and gave them a very attractive offer on the licensing of the weapon, whereas if they bought so many thousand of them, they'd get a free license. And what I heard, the Pentagon thought that was the biggest joke they ever heard, that they told Colt very promptly that that was the first and last buy that would ever be made and go away. They weren't ever interested in making the gun. Well, history proved that was a little wrong. And Colt took great glee in a year or two later going back and telling the Army what it was going to cost them. there was quite a bit of animosity got generated in that. But they're quite right. The first, there was a split buy there. One side thing, General LeMay, who was the head of the Air Force at that time, had lost patience with the Army of ever getting air police equipped with M16s. The production was having problems, and he took that opportunity to break away on a agreement with the Joint Chiefs of Staff that they'd all use the same rifle, and said, well, I can't get the same rifle. I'm going to buy some of these AR-15s. I can get those. So that started that Air Force buy. Then the McNamara's people ordered this 85,000 buy, and that was going to go to the airborne unit, which was stationed in the United States at the time. And so that really was the beginning. And there was some curious things happening. The Army then was really concerned, and they're really upset with this whole deal. And I really firmly believe the Army wanted the whole thing to fail, the whole episode. The only thing that kind of blew up in their face, because they didn't realize that Vietnam was going to get cranked up the way it did. For instance, the Army didn't furnish any training manuals. They didn't even have a bore brush or cleaning rod for these weapons, and they issued 85,000 of them. And luckily, the troops in this airborne division, being they were stateside stationed, liked the weapons, went down to the local hardware stores and bought their cleaning rods and their brushes and their cleaning patches, did their own maintenance work, and had no problems. They were then sent to Vietnam, and they had excellent results with the weapons. They were trained for the use of them. They had the equipment to keep them clean, and went over there. And I know when Westmoreland went over to survey, I think for Kennedy, what they really needed over there, to help them out after they were committed to combat, and the answer was, we need more AR-15 rifles. And Westmoreland came back, told the president, and the president, I guess, got on the phone, and there was literally an open-ended contract made verbally with Colt to start producing.
So now we're up to February, March of '65, when the U.S. commits first ground combat troops in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And many of those units, unlike the airborne troops, went to Vietnam originally equipped with M14s, and then over the next year or so began to transition to AR-15s. What happens after that?
Well, that's when things started really going to pieces over there. It was a very sad thing happened, was the fact that once that big buy started with the weapons, the Army decided and were forced to get into the logistics, and therefore the ammunition logistics became very important. So the Army was put in charge of that, and they first time started to buy ammunition for these weapons, because up until that point in time, Remington supplied all the ammunition as a commercial supplier. So decided to make it legal and official. The Army then took over the task of coming up with a tech data package for the ammunition, and they did. And they specified rather loosely what they really wanted, and that turned out to be a very bad situation, because what they did do is they specified, for instance, muzzle velocity and chamber pressure and nothing else, which meant that the gas port pressure, where the pressure is tapped off to operate the mechanism, wasn't even specified in the tech data package. So the Army then allowed this to happen, and the ammunition that started coming down the supply line to meet the Army requirements was really loaded with a different propellant than what we ever used in the weapons before that. Namely, it was a ball propellant rather than the IMR propellant.
Okay, let's talk about propellants. Improved military rifle propellant versus ball propellant.
Well, ball propellant is a later type of propellant that actually Olin Winchester's proprietary propellant for years. And it has the distinction of being, it's a good propellant, but it has the distinction of being able to be manufactured out of old surplus or out-of-date propellant, whether for artillery or whatever. And it's cheap because it's a continuous process. It's all run through pipes and pumped around with different liquids. And usually, if you're trying to compete with it with the old what we call IMR propellant, which has to be extruded and cut and so forth, you can make ball propellant cheaper because the raw materials are usually cheap, and also it requires less machinery. Its good points are that it's a little higher density. You can get a little more of it in a cartridge case. It also has a little flatter burning curve. In other words, it doesn't peak as much. It has a little to get the same amount of impetus. It can be lower pressures. The bad part about it, in this case, the weapon was designed and the gas port was established to operate at a certain gas port pressure to operate the mechanism. And by going to the ball propellant, the first thing that happened, it increased the pressure considerably, therefore ran the firing rate of the weapon up. I mean, not just a little bit, but quite a bit. In other words, up in the neighborhood of 200 and 300 rounds a minute more. Now, that in itself was a problem, but timing is everything, and Murphy's Law prevails. And at this time that this happened, that this propellant was introduced to the troops and was almost the only propellant available, is when these troops started going overseas that were trained with another rifle and suddenly given this new rifle with no equipment, no training manuals or anything, just said, go get them, fellas. And they, at the same time, got this propellant that was making the weapon malfunction, firing too fast, doing a lot of other things. It became really almost a disaster because they had weapons completely failing in firefights. It just became a real mess and became really the target of a congressional investigation. The other thing that was found out about the ball propellant is that all propellants have deterrents and coatings on them, and most of them have graphite on them to make them pour right, deterrents to make them burn at different speeds. Due to the fact that the ball propellant is manufactured in a lot of cases, there was in that time, almost exclusively out of reclaimed powder, the additives and the deterrents and all those things were relatively unknown, and a lot of those end up as dirt and carbon and sludge and you name it in the rifle mechanism. This rifle had never been tested with that type of propellant. All the millions and millions of rounds we'd fired had all been done with an IMR propellant as the known, and then suddenly, without any, you might say really field tests of any magnitude, they introduced this thing into a wartime situation. And either the lack of training or the propellant change could have probably been tolerated, but not altogether. In other words, when you put the lack of training, lack of maintenance equipment, and the new propellant, pour them into the same situation all at one time, that's what caused the big problem. So it triggered this investigation, this so-called Ichord committee investigation, and they succeeded in a fairly short period of time to get down to the bottom of where the problems were. And I was completely unaware of this when this thing was going on. I was working on other programs, and the first I knew of it, I got called back to Washington with a subpoena to set before the Ichord committee and to tell them what I knew about the rifle program. And of course, I could only tell them about the history of the thing and so forth. But then in that process, after I got through testifying there for a while, the committee asked me to stay on for a while and read different testimonies and comment on it. And that's when I really found out the magnitude of the problems and what was going on. And I was completely disgusted and amazed and everything else. But out of that, the committee decided, they identified who really the culprits were, but they decided in the interest of the morale of the Army that they had better not do anything about it. And Ichord told me, he says, they know who they are and they will fix the problem a lot faster than we putting them in jail and having somebody else new come in and try to fix the problem. Because there were criminal things done, in my opinion, and also in the committee's opinion.
And in fact, they said as much in their in their final report.
Mm-hmm.
The results, one of the results of that series of investigations and a series of fixes undertaken by the Army and Colt in conjunction was the rifle you have in front of you with the black stock, which is the M16A1.
Mm-hmm.
What things were changed on the A1 as compared to the earlier AR-15s?
Well, before this problem of the ammunition was identified, about the only thing that was changed was this bolt closure device was added on. And that's kind of a typical interesting chain of events. The Army's Chief of Staff, I believe, had commented that the U.S. Army had never had a weapon in history where they couldn't help the bolt close by pounding on something, like on the M1 or whatever. They always had something that they, in case that the bolt didn't close, that they could beat on it and close it. So therefore, he thought that this weapon should have one too. And we affectionately call that the Wheeler button, I think after the Chief of Staff of the Army at the time. And so they came to me about it and asked about it, and I said, well, we've tested the AR-10 in this all over the world, and I really haven't seen any excuse for putting this type of a arrangement on, because I said the rationale was that if the weapon is dirty enough or has sand or dirt or mud or something and doesn't close, the first immediate reaction should be is to open the bolt and try to find out the cause of it and not beat it shut and then find out you've got a disaster on your hands. Well, that didn't fly too well. And so they searched around with about at least a dozen designs on this to come up with this device. And the other interesting little side remark was that the program manager of rifles got together with me one day in a hotel in Washington, was showing me all these goodies that he had, and he was kind of up between a rock and a hard place because he'd been ordered to put this on and justify it. So he was trying to find a circumstance where he could prove to his boss, who wanted it on there, that this thing could be used in an instance where nothing else would work. And so the fellow, being pretty clever with rifles, this was Harold Yount, he managed to take some good ammunition and take a pair of pliers and bend them rather severely, but they were clean and they wouldn't quite chamber, and then be able to beat them into the chamber and fire them, and the gun would function normally. And that was about the only circumstance that he could come up with where this would really work. But it satisfied his boss. They added another $5 or $6 or $7 to the cost of the weapon, and it's been on there ever since. So that was the main change that was made to the A1 series of weapon.
And in the course of the Vietnam War, we bought right around 4 million of those, so that became a significant additional cost to the taxpayer.
Well, that's right. And I don't know to this day whether it's really been worth putting on there or how often it's used or whatever, or what value it really is. But that's one of these little quirks that when the Chief of Staff of the Army says, I won't buy it unless it's on there, Colt was happy to put it on because it increased the value of the weapon. Nothing else.
Now, internally, the M16A1 has a chrome-plated bore and chrome-plated chamber part of it.
That came later, though.
Okay.
The chrome plating came in after all the ammunition fouling problems and everything. They found, and it's quite true, and it's a good idea, that chrome plating the bore and chamber helped tremendously in using the other ammunition, or any ammunition in that matter, under adverse conditions. They also changed the buffer assembly and made it considerably heavier so that the bolt group with this higher gas port pressure would run about the right speed. In other words, it slowed down the action to where it didn't break parts like extractors and things like that. So there were two, as I remember, two main changes made on it. And at the same time, they started incorporating 30-round magazines because of the demand in Vietnam.
when we were talking about the expense of adding such a piece onto the weapon.
We were.
At the risk of repeating yourself, can you tell me why that piece is on that? And if you want, if you can lift it up so that it's standing.
Oh, you mean this bolt assist mechanism here? That's to help close the bolt in case of everything else fails. But I've kind of lost my train of thought what we were really talking about.
Well, at that point, what we were talking about was that General Wheeler came down with the edict that needed to be added because the Army always had one.
Mm-hmm.
They had used hit the butt of the rifle or something like that to get it to close and other things, and never once had the rifle been designed to have something to help do that.
Are we trying to recreate this? Is that what you're trying to do?
Yeah, well, we had it held, let me just, like that. And then
Ready.
Tape's rolling and recording.
We lost our cover on the table, didn't we?
And through the magic of television, we can cut into this, right?
simulcast.
Do you need to have him grab it in the same way to set it back down again to cut to your white shot? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, you want to talk about the A2 or not?
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Okay. Well, you lead off.
Okay. And the 70s, after all of the problems with the M16 had been corrected, it was tested by numerous countries and adopted by quite a number. In the case of Singapore, the Philippines, and South Korea, licensed production facilities were set up to manufacture the weapon in those countries. And at the end of the 70s, NATO conducted small arms trials to sort of set parameters for the next generation of NATO weapons. And the M16 came out on top in terms of overall performance. As far as I know, that was a unique experience because before that, if a weapon once had a blemish on its record, it sort of disappeared ignominiously into the back room of some depot and was never seen again. But the M16 was sort of salvaged and has become one of the leading battle rifles of the 20th century. Do you have any philosophical thoughts or other thoughts on that series of events?
No, I think it was quite fortunate, but that's about all. I don't have too much comment on that. It's like any other piece of ordnance. When you build enough of them, you gradually solve most of the problems. And it does take time, in solving not only the technical design problems, but also just assuring quality and parts and uniformity. And it doesn't happen overnight, but before those tests were run in NATO, there were several million of them had been built. So it had that opportunity over, say, any other competitor, that was for sure.
Do you think that military organizations generally expect weapons, both in terms of design but also in terms of the manufacturing period, to mature more rapidly than is really reasonable to anticipate?
Oh, I think they all expect them to mature. That's part of the process. I don't know whether they expect too rapidly or not. Some of them take a lot longer than others. One of the biggest problems historically has been when you have a design, such as the M1 or whatever rifle, and then a new manufacturer comes along, and then there's the problems that they, due to their processing or whatever, uncover problems that are unique, and you start the whole process over again. It's usually introduced by somebody new coming into manufacture. I think we've got a lot of historical facts that we know of in this country that happened both to the M1 and the M14 and the carbine and everything else. And even the 50 caliber machine gun of World War II that ended up with 5 or 6 manufacturers. Literally ended up with 5 or 6 different types of guns almost. So that's generally more of a problem than anything else, I think.
We have in front of us, in addition to the A1 in your hands, the A2 down front. It has a number of changes to it over the A1 to include a heavier front section of the barrel in order to strengthen the front portion of the barrel, new shape of handguards, a bump at the ejection port to make it easier for a left-handed shooter to use it, fully adjustable sights, a more durable, supposedly synthetic stock, and the burst fire feature. This came about because of the work primarily by the Marine Corps, and this weapon is now becoming the standard weapon within the U.S. military. It is, in effect, a product improved M16, M16A1, however you want to phrase that. What is your opinion on such product improvements generally? Or the concept of product improvement, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. Well, the A2 is, I guess, quite an example of product improvement. And as you can see, there are a lot of things added, but personally, I disagree with a lot of the so-called improvements because they were taken into consideration originally in the design and were abandoned. For instance, the adjustable back sight on this weapon is very, very similar to the sight that you saw on the AR-10 rifle with the elevation knob and the windage knob and things that you could easily change while you're firing. I presented this idea with the original rifles to the infantry board at Fort Benning back in the first AR-15 tests, and they were very emphatic on sights that were easy to adjust. They said that their experience, and these were all combat experienced officers in this infantry board, said that they absolutely didn't want any type of quick adjustable sights on any combat rifle. They said, as an example, the M1, which has a marvelous set of sights on it, was probably the best rifle sight they ever saw for shooting at Camp Perry and rifle matches, and the worst one they ever saw for combat usage. And the reason for it was the fact that nervous fingers tend to twist dials and knobs, and in a combat situation was the last place in the world you ever wanted to change the zero on a rifle. You wanted to leave it alone because there's no way to do it in combat. And they had found, all these officers found, and they were unanimous in this opinion, that there was a lot of trouble with the sights on the M1 in actual combat use. So they wanted a fixed sight, and I talked them out of that and said that there should be a sight put on there that could be adjusted with some difficulty, but just zero it in and don't ever make an attempt to change it in combat. So this became I think, a very poor choice. I know how it got there because the people in charge at the time were all what we call team shooters or target shooters. And they decided this was an excellent opportunity to make the weapon more of a target rifle rather than a combat rifle.
Rolling and recording. Selma, you want to direct to this?
Okay. Ready? And just lift it, please, Mr. Stoner.
Yeah. Can you do that again for me?
Do it slower?
No, I'll just be on top of it a little bit better. Okay, I'm ready.
Why don't we get a little bit wider on this?
Okay.
Okay.
The M16, of course, has a lot longer association in life since you let go of it as a design than when you actually were in control of it. What does it feel like as a designer to sort of cast your child off into the unmerciful clutches of the people who manufacture it and sort of take it from there?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I one time or the other tried to get back in and make some contribution, to the weapon, and it turned out to be rather a fruitless thing. I was told that, for instance, I wanted at one time, due to some field problems they had, to go in and I suggested to the Army and how to make the weapon a little better, and particularly in corrosion-resistant materials. And they said, well, that's real nice, and they would think about it. And so they got back with me and said, this is going to cost $5 or $6 more to make the weapon corrosion resistant, and we don't feel that it's cost effective to do such a thing. And I said, well, this is no consideration to the man in the field that's trying to stay alive with it. And they said, no, but that had nothing to do with it. It was the cost effectiveness that guided these things. And with that kind of a answer, I just kind of threw up my hands and said there's not much one can offer as far as redesign or contributions to the thing. But materials do change, and when these new materials come along, you'd like to be able to, I think, introduce them into something that, this is important as this. I think on this A2, this handguard arrangement is an excellent improvement, because the fact that it gets down to one molding that does the work of two. And I think that was a good idea. I think one thing that might be of interest to you, after this product improvement model was approved by the Marine Corps, they asked me to come up and take a look at it and gave me a briefing on it. And I commented on it quite frankly, and it wasn't exact. And they also gave me the report, and I wasn't too impressed with some of the things that they did, and I told them so. And then right after that, the Commandant of the Marine Corps asked me to come up and personally tell him what I thought, and I told him and what my thoughts were, and he thanked me very much and said, well, I realize where you're coming from, but on the other hand, the Marines did all this, and therefore they feel like it's more their baby. And even though that some of these so-called improvements you doubt, it might be better from a morale standpoint and all just to leave it alone. And I said, well, you are a better judge than I am on that, and if you think so, I said, fine, but I said some of these things, it's just a pity to work so hard on an original design to make it light and then turn around and arbitrarily put weight on the weapon and everything for no other reason than it feels better and shoots a little straighter on a rifle range competitive shoot. It has nothing to do with the combat effectiveness. The fact is it's subtracting from it by making the weapon more heavy. And we discussed the burst limiter, and I said that to me it was absolutely ridiculous, and told them why. I said, with the experience that we had in Vietnam, for instance, all the original weapons had 20-round magazines, such as you see here. And in Vietnam, we found out that when the troops came up against the AK-47, which had a 30-round magazine, they felt like they were outgunned and all started writing home to their congressman and demanding that they have more magazine capacity. And Colt immediately had to tool up and come up with a 30-round magazine because it became a morale problem, not a moral problem, but a morale problem. And I see the same thing with your burst limiter. I told him, I said, the first time the troops come up in the field and they fire a 3-round burst and the enemy shoots 30-round bursts at them, they're going to feel like they're completely outgunned, and we're going to go through the same routine again. The Commandant said, well, I considered that, but he says with a pair of long-nosed pliers we can fix this situation and take the 3-round burst limiter out and everybody will be happy, and that'll be a field fix. So, oh, those were my general comments on what had been done. And like I say, some of these things I approve of, and some of them I think that they have nothing to do with making the effectiveness of the weapon change.
Okay, I'm rolling and recording anytime, so.
All right, go ahead. Who's moving?
Mr. Stoner is.
Okay.
Go ahead, and this time with both hands, just pick it up.
Put it back down again.
You might turn it over and
Show that this is the same as this.
Two for one.
Mhm.
Instead of down again.